On the morning of September 11, 2001, the skies above America were painted the clearest shade of blue. It was the kind of morning that pilots dream about. Perfect visibility, temperatures in the low 70s, not a cloud in sight from coast to coast. At Newark International Airport in New Jersey, United Airlines Flight 93 sat on the tarmac waiting for clearance. The Boeing 757 was scheduled to depart at 8 o'clock for San Francisco, a routine transcontinental flight that had been running daily for years. But that morning, nothing went according to schedule. Heavy traffic congestion at Newark delayed the flight. Minutes ticked by. 8 o'clock became 8:15, then 8:30. The passengers settled into their seats, some frustrated by the delay, others simply resigned to it. They had no way of knowing that this 42-minute delay would change the course of history. At 8:42 in the morning, 42 minutes behind schedule, United Flight 93 finally lifted off from Newark. The plane climbed into that perfect September sky, carrying 37 passengers, 7 crew members, and 4 hijackers who had been waiting patiently in a first class. 16 minutes later, while Flight 93 was still climbing toward its cruising altitude, American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. The passengers on Flight 93 knew nothing of this. They were settling in for what they thought would be a 5.5-hour flight to San Francisco. Some opened laptops. Others pulled out newspapers or magazines. A few ordered breakfast from the flight attendants. At 9:03 in the morning, as Flight 93 crossed into Pennsylvania airspace, United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower of the World Trade Center. Still, the passengers knew nothing. The crew, however, was about to receive a warning. At 9:24, a message arrived in the cockpit through the aircraft communication, addressing, and reporting system. Flight dispatcher Ed Ballinger, who is responsible for multiple transcontinental flights, had been frantically sending alerts since learning of the World Trade Center attacks. The message read, "Beware any cockpit intrusion. 2 aircraft hit World Trade Center." Captain Jason Dahl, a 43-year-old veteran pilot who had been flying for United for 16 years, read the cryptic warning and responded with confusion. "Ed, confirm latest message, please," he typed back. "Jason." He would never receive an answer. 4 minutes later, at 9:28 in the morning, the hijacking began. To understand what happened aboard Flight 93, we must first understand the men who took control of it. There were 4 hijackers on the flight, 1 fewer than the 5-man teams that had commandeered the other 3 aircraft that morning. Intelligence agencies later determined that a 5th hijacker, Mohammed al-Qahtani, had been denied entry to the United States by a suspicious immigration officer in Orlando just weeks before the attacks. The leader of the group was Ziad Jarrah, a 26-year-old Lebanese man who had trained as a pilot. Unlike the other hijacker pilots that day, Jarrah came from an affluent secular family. He had studied at universities in Germany and had a long-time girlfriend who knew nothing of his radicalization. Of all the September 11th hijackers, Jarrah appeared the most conflicted about his mission. The 3 muscle hijackers, as the Federal Bureau of Investigation would later call them, were Ahmed al-Nami, Ahmed al-Haznawi, and Said al-Ghamdi. All 3 were Saudi nationals who had arrived in the United States just months before the attacks. Their job was to storm the cockpit, subdue the passengers, and protect Jarrah while he flew the plane to its target. At 9:28, they made their move. The first indication that something was wrong came through a radio transmission picked up by air traffic controllers in Cleveland. Amidst the routine chatter of flight communications controllers, heard screaming and shouting from Flight 93. "Mayday! Mayday!" a male voice shouted. "Get out of here! Get out of here!" When Melody Homer, the wife of First Officer Leroy Homer, later listened to the recording, she identified her husband's voice. He was shouting a warning, a desperate attempt to alert controllers on the ground that something terrible was happening 35,000 feet above eastern Ohio. The cockpit voice recorder recovered from the crash site captured the chaos of those first moments. Captain Jason Dahl could be heard moaning, apparently wounded. A woman believed to be head flight attendant Deborah Welsh was heard pleading with the hijackers. "Please, please don't hurt me," she begged. "Oh God." Her cries were followed by what investigators believe was the sound of her being killed. Within minutes, Jarrah had taken the pilot's seat. At 9:32, he addressed the passengers over what he thought was the plane's intercom system, but in his unfamiliarity with the aircraft, he had pressed the wrong button, broadcasting his message to air traffic controllers instead. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jara said in heavily accented English, "Here, the captain, please sit down. Keep remaining seating. We have a bomb on board, so sit." The plane turned southeast and began heading toward Washington District of Columbia. In the rear of the aircraft, the passengers had been herded to the back rows by the hijackers. They sat in stunned silence, uncertain of what was happening, clinging to the hope that this was a traditional hijacking, that they would land somewhere, that negotiations would follow, that they would eventually be released. But then the phone calls began. Flight 93 was equipped with GTE airphone systems that allowed passengers to make calls from their seats. Several passengers also had mobile phones that at certain altitudes and positions could connect to cell towers below. In the roughly 30 minutes between the hijacking and the crash, at least 10 passengers and 2 crew members made calls to loved ones, emergency services, and airline personnel. These calls would transform everything. Tom Burnett was the first to realize the full horror of their situation. A 38-year-old executive from San Ramon, California, Burnett had served as a high school quarterback and had built a successful career in the medical device industry. He was traveling to San Francisco for a business meeting. Burnett called his wife Dina 4 times during the hijacking. In their first conversation, he told her that the plane had been hijacked, that a passenger had been stabbed, and that the hijackers claimed to have a bomb. He asked her to call the authorities. Dina Burnett, a former flight attendant, was watching the news coverage of the World Trade Center attacks when her husband called. During their second conversation, she told him what she was seeing on television. Tom Burnett's response would echo through history. "Oh my God," he said, "it's a suicide mission." In that moment, he understood what the passengers of the other hijacked flights had not had time to discover. This was not a hostage situation. There would be no negotiations, no demands, no eventual release. The hijackers intended to use the plane as a weapon. Jeremy Glick, a 31-year-old judo champion from New Jersey, reached his wife Liz at her parents' home in upstate New York. Like Burnett, he learned about the World Trade Center attacks during their conversation. "They're going to crash the plane into a building," Liz told him. Glick paused for a moment. Then he told his wife that the passengers were discussing a plan. Mark Bingham, a 31-year-old public relations executive from San Francisco, called his mother Alice Hoagland in California. Bingham was a former rugby player, 6 feet 4 inches tall, who had once wrestled a gun away from a mugger on the streets of San Francisco. "I want to let you know that I love you," Bingham told his mother, "in case I don't see you again." Alice Hoagland, a former United Airlines flight attendant, urged her son to stay calm. But as the call continued, she sensed that her son was talking confidentially with someone nearby. She felt that maybe someone had organized a plan. Flight attendant Sandy Bradshaw called her husband Phil and told him what was happening. Then she explained that she had slipped into the galley. "We're going to do something," she said. "I'm filling pitchers with boiling water." Her last words to her husband were simple and urgent. "Everyone's running to first class. I've got to go. Bye." The most detailed account of the passengers' final moments came from a call made by Todd Beamer, a 32-year-old software salesman from Cranberry, New Jersey. Beamer was a former college athlete, a devoted father of 2 young sons with a 3rd child on the way. He had a reputation for calm under pressure, for taking charge in difficult situations. At 9:43 in the morning, Beamer tried to place a credit card call through the airphone but was routed to a customer service representative. She passed him on to her supervisor, a woman named Lisa Jefferson. For the next 13 minutes, Lisa Jefferson became Todd Beamer's connection to the world outside the hijacked aircraft. Beamer spoke in a voice that Jefferson later described as devoid of any stress. He was so calm, in fact, that she initially doubted the authenticity of his call. He reported that the plane had been hijacked, that 1 passenger had been killed, that 2 of the hijackers had knives, and that 1 appeared to have a bomb strapped around his waist. Jefferson contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who began listening in on the call. As the minutes passed, Beamer provided updates. The plane was making erratic movements. The passengers were gathering in the back of the aircraft. They were forming a plan. He told Jefferson about the other passengers involved in the plot: Tom Burnett, Jeremy Glick, Mark Bingham, and others whose names would later be confirmed through the cockpit voice recorder. Then Beamer asked Jefferson a favor. "If I don't make it," he said, "please call my family and let them know how much I love them." Jefferson agreed. Then, as the passengers prepared to act, Beamer asked if she would pray with him. Together over the phone, Lisa Jefferson and Todd Beamer recited the Lord's Prayer. "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. And forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen." When the prayer was finished, Beamer recited the 23rd Psalm. Other passengers nearby joined in. Then Jefferson heard muffled voices as the passengers conferred one final time. Through the open line, she heard Todd Beamer speak to the others. "Are you ready?" he asked. A pause. "Okay, let's roll." Those were the last words Lisa Jefferson heard from Todd Beamer. The passenger revolt began at 9:57 in the morning. From what investigators were able to piece together, from the cockpit voice recorder phone calls and flight data, the passengers used a food service cart as a battering ram. They charged up the aisle toward the cockpit, overwhelming at least one hijacker who had been standing guard outside the door. On the cockpit recording, the sounds of the assault are unmistakable. Breaking glass, shattering dishes, shouting, screaming. One of the hijackers in the cockpit cried out, "Is there something afight?" Another responded urgently, "They want to get in here. Hold from the inside. Hold." Jara at the controls began to rock the plane violently from side to side, trying to throw the passengers off balance. When that failed, he pitched the nose up and down in a desperate attempt to stop their advance. But the passengers kept coming. "In the cockpit," one of them shouted. "If we don't, we'll die." Another yelled, "Roll it." This may have been a reference to the food cart which they were using to batter down the cockpit door. At 10 o'clock in this morning, one of the hijackers was heard saying in Arabic, "I am injured." The battle raged on. On the cockpit voice recorder, investigators could hear what sounded like 3 cries of pain or distress from a hijacker outside the cockpit, suggesting that the passengers had reached and were attacking the man guarding the door. Inside the cockpit, Jara and another hijacker debated their options. "Shall we finish it off?" one asked in Arabic. "No, not yet," came the reply. "When they all come, we finish it off." But the passengers were almost through. At 10:02, amidst the sounds of crashing and screaming, a male voice shouted, "Turn it up!" Then another said, "In the cockpit! In the cockpit!" One of the hijackers screamed in Arabic, "Pull it down! Pull it down!" Another hijacker, possibly Jara, shouted back, Hey, give it to me! Give it to me!" He may have been reaching for the control yoke, trying to crash the plane before the passengers could take control. In the final seconds, amid screams and shouts, the hijackers began chanting in Arabic, "Allah is the greatest! Allah is the greatest!" An English speaker's voice cried out, "No!" But the plane was already in its final dive. At 10:03 and 11 seconds, United Airlines Flight 93 crashed into a reclaimed coal strip mine in Stony Creek Township near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. It struck the ground at 580 miles per hour, creating a crater 30 feet deep and scorching acres of surrounding farmland. Everyone on board was killed instantly. The plane was just 20 minutes flying time from Washington District of Columbia. In the hours and days that followed, investigators worked to understand what had happened aboard Flight 93. The cockpit voice recorder was found buried 25 feet below the surface at the crash site. The flight data recorder was recovered nearby. Together, they provided an unprecedented record of a hijacking, a passenger revolt, and a crash. But questions remained. Had the passengers actually breached the cockpit door? Had they managed to get inside and fight the hijackers for control of the plane? The 9/11 Commission concluded that the hijackers remained at the controls but must have judged that the passengers were only seconds from overcoming them. They crashed the plane rather than lose control of it. Some family members who listened to the cockpit recording believe the passengers did breach the cockpit. They point to sounds that suggest a physical struggle over the controls voices mixing English and Arabic in the final seconds. The truth may never be known with certainty. What is certain is that the passengers' revolt prevented the hijackers from reaching their intended target. Intelligence assessments and the 9/11 Commission determined that Flight 93 was almost certainly headed for Washington, District of Columbia. The most likely targets were the United States Capitol building or the White House. Both buildings were in session or occupied that morning. Had the plane reached either target, the death toll could have been catastrophic. Vice President Dick Cheney, watching events unfold from a bunker beneath the White House, had authorized military aircraft to shoot down Flight 93 if necessary. But by the time fighter jets could have reached the plane, it had already crashed in Pennsylvania. Upon learning of the crash, Cheney is reported to have said, "I think an act of heroism just took place on that plane." The 7 crew members of Flight 93 were the first to face the hijackers, and most gave their lives defending the cockpit. Captain Jason Dahl was 43 years old, a native of San Jose, California, who had dreamed of flying since childhood. He earned his pilot's license at 16 and joined the Civil Air Patrol at 13. He had traded shifts with another pilot so he could take his wife Sandy to London the following weekend for their 5th wedding anniversary. First Officer Leroy Homer was 36 years old, a graduate of the United States Air Force Academy who had flown combat missions in Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. He had a daughter who was just 14 months old. The flight attendants were Lorraine Bay, Sandra Bradshaw, Wanda Green, Cece Lyles, and Deborah Welsh. They had a combined 100 years of service with United Airlines. When the hijacking began, they helped passengers make phone calls, provided information to authorities on the ground, and in some cases joined the revolt. Cece Lyles, a former police officer from Fort Pierce, Florida, called her husband Lorne twice during the hijacking. In her second call, she told him, "They're forcing their way into the cockpit." Sandy Bradshaw, who had been flying for 11 years, was the one who filled pitchers with boiling water to use as weapons against the hijackers. These women did not hide. They did not cower. They fought back. The 33 passengers came from all walks of American life. There were executives and salespeople, students and retirees, parents and children. There was a Japanese exchange student named Toshia Kuge who was returning home after a vacation in America. There was a wheelchair advocate named Colleen Fraser who had once commandeered a paratransit bus to lobby Congress for the Americans with Disabilities Act. There was a federal wildlife enforcement officer named Richard Guadagno who had spent his career protecting endangered species. There was Lauren Grancolis, who was 3 months pregnant with her first child. She left a message for her husband Jack that morning. "I just want to tell you that I love you," she said. "Please tell my family I love them too." There was Honor Elizabeth Wainio, who told her stepmother over the phone that she and other passengers were going to rush the hijackers. Her stepmother kept her on the line as long as possible. "I've got to go," Honor finally said. "They're getting ready to break into the cockpit. I love you. Goodbye." And there was Diora Bodley, a 20-year-old college student who was the youngest passenger on the flight. She had been returning home to California after visiting friends on the East Coast. These were ordinary Americans who, in the space of 30 minutes, learned that their lives were being used as weapons against their country, and they decided to fight back. In the years since September 11, 2001, the story of Flight 93 has become part of American history. President George W. Bush visited Shanksville 1 year after the attacks. Standing in the field where the plane had crashed, he addressed the families of the passengers and crew. Let us also remember that the first victory in this war came on a hijacked plane bound for the nation's capital. Bush said, "Somehow the brave men and women on Flight 93, knowing they would die, found the courage to use their final moments to save the lives of others. Few are called to show the kind of valor seen on Flight 93 or on the field of battle. Yet all of us do share a calling: be strong in adversity and unafraid in danger." Todd Beamer's rallying cry of "Let's roll" became a national motto. In his 2002 State of the Union address, President Bush invoked the phrase to describe America's response to terrorism. "For too long, our culture has said, 'If it feels good, do it,'" the president said. Now America is embracing a new ethic and a new creed. Let's roll. In 2002, Congress unanimously passed the Flight 93 National Memorial Act. The memorial, designed to honor the passengers and crew, was built at the crash site in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. The first phase was dedicated on the 10th anniversary of the attacks in September 2011. It includes the wall of names, 40 panels of polished white marble inscribed with the names of the passengers and crew. The panels are arranged along the flight path pointing toward the crash site, which remains sacred ground and the final resting place of those who died. In 2015, a visitor center and learning center opened, providing educational exhibits about the events of that day. In 2018, the Tower of Voices was dedicated, marking the completion of the memorial. The tower stands 93 feet tall, a tribute to the flight number. Within it hang 40 wind chimes, one for each passenger and crew member. When the wind blows across the Pennsylvania countryside, the chimes create what the memorial describes as a living memorial to forever commemorate the voices of the 40 heroes. In 2020, the final 40 chimes were hung and dedicated in the tower. The passengers of Flight 93 have been honored in countless ways since their deaths. Todd Beamer's widow Lisa wrote a best-selling book about her husband titled Let's Roll: Ordinary People, Extraordinary Courage. A high school in Federal Way, Washington was named after him. A post office in his hometown of Cranberry, New Jersey bears his name. Mark Bingham's mother Alice became an advocate for airline safety and LGBTQ rights. The gymnasium at the Eureka Valley Recreation Center in San Francisco was renamed in his honor. A documentary film, The Rugby Player, tells his story. Tom Burnett's hometown of Bloomington, Minnesota, renamed a post office after him. His former high school retired his football jersey number. A memorial scholarship was established in his name. Jeremy Glick received the Medal of Heroism posthumously. A trail in West Milford, New Jersey, and a scenic overlook bear his name. All four men, along with the other passengers and crew, were posthumously awarded the Arthur Ashe Courage Award in 2002. At the National September 11th Memorial in New York City, the names of the Flight 93 passengers and crew are inscribed on panels S67 and S68 at the South Pool. Their names are read aloud every year on the anniversary of the attacks. What happened aboard United Flight 93 on September 11, 2001 was unprecedented in the history of aviation. In the hundreds of hijackings that had occurred since the 1960s, passengers had always been instructed to remain calm, cooperate with the hijackers, and wait for authorities to negotiate their release. The assumption was always that hijackers wanted something, that they would make demands, that a peaceful resolution was possible. The passengers of Flight 93 learned in real time that the old rules no longer applied. They discovered through phone calls to loved ones that they were aboard a suicide mission, and they made a democratic decision to fight back. They took a vote. They organized themselves. They armed themselves with whatever they could find: boiling water, fire extinguishers, a food service cart, and they charged the cockpit knowing they would likely die, but hoping they might save lives on the ground. They were not soldiers. They had no training in counterterrorism. They were business people and students, flight attendants and fathers. They were Americans who, in the darkest moment of their lives, chose to act. The 9/11 Commission called it the Battle for United 93. Historians have called it the first counterattack in America's war on terror. Brendan Corner, who studied hundreds of hijackings for his book, The Skies Belong to Us, said he had never come across anything like the Flight 93 revolt. These were ordinary people, Kerner noted, who made an extraordinary choice in an impossible situation. On the 16th anniversary of the attacks, Vice President Mike Pence spoke at the Flight 93 National Memorial. He addressed the families of those who had died, the first responders who had worked at the crash site, and the Americans who had come to pay their respects. Without regard to personal safety, Pence said, they rushed forward to save lives. I will always believe that I and many others in our nation's capital were able to go home that day and hug our families because of the courage and sacrifice of the heroes of Flight 93. The Capitol Dome still stands today because of what happened on that flight. The White House still stands. Thousands of people who might have died that morning went home to their families instead. A common field in Pennsylvania became a field of honor, and 40 ordinary Americans became heroes. Today, visitors travel from around the world to the Flight 93 National Memorial. They walk the paths that lead to the Wall of Names. They stand at the edge of the crash site, that sacred ground where the passengers and crew took their final stand. When the wind blows, they can hear the Tower of Voices singing its 40-note song, a melody for those who cannot speak for themselves. The memorial's mission statement reads, "A common field one day, a field of honor forever. May all who visit this place remember the collective acts of courage and sacrifice of the passengers and crew revere this hallowed ground as the final resting place of those heroes, and reflect on the power of individuals who choose to make a difference. The passengers of Flight 93 had roughly 30 minutes from the time they learned the truth about their situation until the moment of impact. In those 30 minutes, they transformed from hostages into warriors, from victims into heroes. They knew they were going to die. They could have spent their final moments in prayer, in tears, in the arms of loved ones on the phone. Instead, they chose to fight. Todd Beamer said it best in those 4 simple words that still echo through American history. Let's roll. In the years since September 11th, aviation security has been transformed. Cockpit doors are now reinforced and locked. Air marshals fly on commercial flights. Passengers no longer assume that cooperation with hijackers is the safest course of action. But perhaps the most important legacy of Flight 93 is simpler than any security measure. It is the knowledge that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, can choose courage. They can choose to act. They can choose to sacrifice themselves for others. The passengers of Flight 93 did not know each other before that morning. They came from different cities, different backgrounds, different walks of life. Some were religious, others were not. Some were young, others were approaching retirement. They had nothing in common except a shared flight and a shared fate. And yet when the moment came, they found each other. They formed a plan, they took a vote, and they charged forward together into the unknown. That is the story of Flight 93. That is the story of what Americans can do when they choose to fight. That is the story of 40 heroes who, with their final breaths, reminded the world what courage looks like. The cockpit voice recording ends at 10:03 and 9 seconds on the morning of September 11th, 2001. The final entry on the flight data recorder was made 1 second later at 10:03 and 10. Then silence. The silence has been filled in the years since with memorials and tributes books and film ceremonies and remembrances. But the truest memorial to the passengers of Flight 93 is not made of marble or bronze. It is the Capitol building still standing in Washington. It is the lives of thousands of people who were not killed that day. It is the choice that each of us makes every day about what kind of person we will be when the moment comes. The passengers of Flight 93 made their choice. Now the question is, what will we do with the lives they saved?